Alright, so being and nothingness. Let's just jump straight into the introduction. Section 1 is the phenomenon, and all Sartre is going to do here is just cover what phenomenology has, how it changes the picture from the old Cartesian kind of subject-object framework that was around before him. So the phenomenon, it's, what is it? It replaces this idea of the object. So when we talk about a phenomenon, we're talking about what used to be considered the object. How is it different? Like I said last video, it's a different picture of, it's a different way of thinking about how we relate to the world. So instead of there being this external object which we create internal representations of, we have what's called the existent or the phenomenon. And how that reveals itself to us is through those adumbrations or Abschattung that we talked about as well. So it has an infinite number of those adumbrations, but each adumbration reveals the existent to us completely. That's the main difference that Sartre talks about. And in this section, he's concerned with getting rid of a whole bunch of dualisms that held sway under that Cartesian way of thinking, and collapsing them down into a single dualism, the finite and the infinite. So those three dualisms, or the four dualisms he talks about, the three of them are quite similar, so I'll mention those first. They are the interior, the exterior, being and appearance, and essence and appearance. And basically they all relate to the old object in that subject-object schema. So the object, the idea is that there's like an internal essence to something, to an object that we have no access to. All we have access to is that external appearance, which we use to create our internal representations of. And that's kind of the old paradigm. Phenomenology dispenses with that and reduces it to the finite and the infinite. How does it do that? Through those adumbrations, through those Abschattung. So there's the finite is encapsulated in the individual adumbrations that we have, through which each phenomenon or existent reveals itself to us. So each adumbration is finite and complete, but there are an infinite number of those adumbrations. That's the finite infinite dualism there. And also the other dualism is between act and potency. And so this is again under the old paradigm. Sartre talks about it with reference to genius. So if we consider an author who writes a novel, say, that act of writing the novel produces something, and we can access, or we can see the genius apparent in that novel. But there's also genius still in the author, kind of a potential capability waiting to be utilized. So there's genius kind of manifests in both those dimensions. In a way, this is kind of like the dealing with the subject half of that subject-object dichotomy. So that's what act and potency was all about. Again, Sartre thinks that phenomenology dispenses with that into the finite and the infinite, and it does so in exactly the same way. We just get rid of this idea of potency altogether. Sartre doesn't like that. He thinks that the act is all that there is, and the finite dimension of the act will be the novel, the final, the completed work. And when we think about a novel, we can, those adumbrations come up again, because everything reveals itself to us as a phenomenon, as an existent, even say a novel in this case. And one adumbration through which we can know that novel would be, say, one interpretation of that novel, or one way of approaching that novel, one way of thinking about the novel, and that is one adumbration, one abschatung. But so that's the finite aspect, but there's also, of course, an infinite number of adumbrations surrounding that that novel, or that make up that novel, and that's the infinite aspect that Sartre is talking about. So those old dualisms, four of them, they collapse into a single dualism, finite and the infinite. And Sartre finishes this section just with a little sentence. He says that phenomenology has replaced the reality of the thing with the objectivity of the phenomenon. And in that sentence, objectivity doesn't mean existing independently of me, but that it is there and it is not me. That the series of its appearances is bound by a principle which does not depend on my whim. And that's phenomenology, and that's what it's done for us. So the second section, phenomenon of being and the being of the phenomenon. Now this takes a while to get your head around. It's kind of, you can kind of just drift in circles, well I did anyway when I was first thinking about it. So let's just take a look at that sentence first, the being of the phenomenon and the phenomenon of being. What's the, let's take the last part first, the being of phenomena. So the being of phenomena is basically existence. That's what we're after. That's what we're trying to uncover in this introduction. I call it ontological bedrock. It's what existence is, the being of phenomena. So the first part of that equation then, the phenomenon of being, what's that about? Well, phenomenon is, as we saw, it replaces that idea of the object. So a phenomenon is anything we can think about. It's any existent that we can contemplate or that we see in the world around us. And everything appears to us as a phenomenon. When we think about anything, it always appears as a phenomenon with that those infinite abschatum attached to it. So the phenomenon of being is existence itself, as it appears to us, of course, as a phenomenon. It always appears as a phenomenon. Everything appears as a phenomenon to us. So what Sartre is asking is the phenomenon of being, when we think about being and we apprehend it through this phenomenon, through these abschatum, is that the same as existence itself, the being of phenomena, ontological bedrock. So to investigate this, he starts out by looking at a particular being. Can we just go from a particular existent? Can we go from there to being itself? The answer to that is no, because a particular thing, an existent, a phenomenon, is not related to existence. Instead, it just is. It's not related to existence, it just exists. So we can't get behind that an existent to what makes it exist, to that ontological bedrock. And then he turns to what will be the answer to the question of this section. He asks, can we just look at being itself? Can we just look at ontological bedrock directly? And the answer to that is no. And the reason for that is because when we do look at existence, we see, of course, existence as phenomenon. Everything reveals itself to us as a phenomenon. So when we look for existence itself, we see a phenomenon of existence. That's the phenomenon of being. And that phenomenon, like all phenomena, obscures being. Sartre says we can't get through that phenomena to ontological bedrock. So that's the final conclusion there. The phenomenon of being does not let us get through to the being of phenomena, ontological bedrock. So we need something else. We need what Sartre calls the transphenomenality of being. And that is what we're going to look at in section 3 right now. So let's move on to section 3, the pre-reflective cogito and the being of the percipere, which is Latin for to perceive. Cogito, by the way, will come up a lot in Sartre's writing, and it just means consciousness, essentially. So the way Sartre starts off here is he's looking, we've already established we're looking for the transphenomenal being. We're looking for that ontological bedrock, and in order to get there, Sartre is going to look at perception, investigate perception. And so there are kind of two poles of perception. There's the perceiver and the thing perceived. And that perceiver, or in the title, the being of the percipere, the percipere for the being of that percipere for Sartre is consciousness. And that is actually the transphenomenal being of the subject. So we've hit ontological bedrock here already with consciousness, and it's that the subject half of the equation, the perception equation, perceiver and the thing perceived. So we've got consciousness. What is consciousness? Sartre briefly mentions that, wants to talk about consciousness here, and the first thing he says is that it is intentional, and this is extremely important to get your head around when you're dealing with phenomenology and Sartre's philosophy in particular. So what does intentional mean? It means that consciousness is always consciousness of something. It's never just consciousness by itself. There is no content to consciousness. There's no substance to consciousness. It's always directed at something else. You can kind of, in a way, you can kind of think of it like a hole in the wall. If there's consciousness is this hole, it's nothing in itself. There's nothing there. But when things pass by on the other side, then something appears in that hole when I'm looking out, and whatever appears there, that's what consciousness is at that time. It's consciousness of that thing. But when it's gone and there's nothing there, that's what consciousness is nothing. It's just that hole. It's empty. On its own, it's nothing. It needs something else in order for there to be any content to it. That's really crucial to keep in mind. So consciousness is always consciousness of something. It's always intentional. But for that to be true, Sartre says that it must also be consciousness of itself, as being consciousness of the existent or the phenomenon. So there's a little bit to kind of unpack there. The first thing to note, perhaps, in that is it seems like an awkward expression, right? Consciousness of something. We would normally say conscious of something. I'm conscious of something. The reason Sartre has chosen to use that, and the reason we should use it as well, is because that is, if we slip back into this conscious of, what is conscious of? I. We've gone back to some kind of Cartesian substance, subject, that's a spectator viewing the world, and consciousness belongs to that spectator. Sartre is definitely wants to avoid that world view. So it's not that I am conscious of something, it's that there is consciousness of something, and that's it's an important distinction, and it probably sounds bizarre to use it like that at first, but you need to get used to it, because we're gonna be talking about that this whole book, and it really is important to understand that distinction between being consciousness of something and conscious of something. So with that out of the way, let's just go back to what I said. For consciousness to be consciousness of an existent, it must be consciousness of itself as being consciousness of that existent. So we've just gone like a level behind that, or a level deeper than that basic intentional nature of consciousness, to this level where it's consciousness of itself. Again, not self-conscious. We can kind of think of it in those terms, but just remember that it's not exactly the same as being self-conscious. It's consciousness of itself, consciousness of consciousness. And why does he think that? Why does he think that this must be true? If consciousness is intentional, why must it also be consciousness of itself? Well, because if it wasn't, then it would be a consciousness ignorant of itself. That is to say, it is an unconsciousness. And that, for Sartre, is absurd. So as soon as we have this intentional aspect of consciousness, we can see that there must be this self-consciousness, in this consciousness of consciousness. And just keeping rolling with that idea, this consciousness of consciousness there are so many consciousnesses here. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm trying to make it as acceptable to your ear as possible. This self-consciousness, this consciousness of consciousness, is not founded on knowledge. So that's another important thing to bear in mind. It's knowledge is kind of a level above where we are. We want to be on ontological bedrock. Knowledge is one step above. Knowledge posits an object for a subject. That's kind of the structure of knowledge, according to Sartre. We are not at that level yet. We're down here still on ontological bedrock. So it's not knowledge. We're not positing an object for ourselves. We're not saying that consciousness of consciousness is not positing itself as an object for itself. We're below that. We're at the level of ontological bedrock, and this Sartre calls an immediate consciousness. So it's consciousness of itself in an immediate way. So it's not positing itself as an object for itself. That's the key point to note there. So there's a couple of new terms there. First, positional and non-positional. Positional just means that you've posited something as an object for a subject. So if something's been posited, then we're at that level of knowledge, not on that deeper transphenomenal level, which is where we want to be at the moment. So there's that positional, non-positional, that's going to come up later. This consciousness of consciousness is non-positional. It's not positing itself as an object. And there's another term which will come in useful very soon, which is thetic and non-thetic. So thetic is basically refers to having an explicit focus on something, as opposed to non-thetic, which is more like there being kind of a background awareness of something without it being explicitly directly focused upon. So we've got positional, non-positional, thetic and non-thetic, and we've got this consciousness of consciousness. So Sartre's going to make it a little bit easier for us. We're not going to have to keep calling it consciousness of consciousness. Instead, he says that is actually what he calls pre-reflective or non-reflective consciousness. And that is it's beneath that level, like I say, beneath that level of knowledge or reflective consciousness, which takes place up here, positing objects for a viewing subject. We're down here still. This non-reflective, pre-reflective consciousness, it's also non-positional, so it's not positing itself as an object for itself, and it's also non-thetic, so it's taking place in the background. It's running in the background without us directly paying explicit attention to it. So the example Sartre gives for this is counting cigarettes. something I'm sure you do every day. Yeah, counting cigarettes. So anyway, let's run with that. So when you're counting cigarettes, you're doing that, Sartre says, without paying attention to what you're doing. You're not explicitly, you're not thetically focused on yourself as this person counting, as this consciousness counting. What are you thetically focused on? The cigarettes, as you're pulling them out and as you're counting them. So why does he think that there is this background pre-reflective consciousness? Because if when you finish counting, if someone asks you what were you just doing, you can answer. You can say, oh, I was counting cigarettes. How do you know that? Because you weren't thetically, you weren't actively paying attention to what you were doing, you were just doing it. So there is this background awareness, this non-reflective consciousness always running in the background, and that's what we're talking about. That's this immediate consciousness. It's non-thetic and it's non-positional. So what this means is that the pre-reflective consciousness is, first of all, it's primary to reflection. It's before reflection, but also it's the condition which renders reflection possible in the first place. If we didn't have this non-positional, non-thetic, pre-reflective consciousness running, we would never be able to think, to engage in reflective thought either. So that's the first point. The second point is that it also renders action itself possible, which is kind of a surprising thing to say. But the justification he gives for this is that without this pre-reflective consciousness, we have nothing to tie all of our actions together in a coherent, unified whole. If it's just individual actions and consciousness of those actions, there's no kind of background awareness, nothing we can step back from and tie everything together into a bigger picture. So in that sense, it renders action possible. So we've done quite a bit of work with this section already, and Sartre is going to finish up with by talking about his famous slogan, "Existence precedes essence." The basic gist of this is that we've discovered that consciousness is this transphenomenal being of the subject, and which means that it's ontological bedrock. It's the center of being. It is being, actually, and what that means is that the essence of consciousness can only come after that initial existence has already been is already there. Without that, then it can only follow on from the fact that it already exists. So essence comes after existence. And he finishes just by saying that consciousness can't be a substance. That's a real Cartesian idea, and that follows from the fact that we've already seen consciousness as a hole in the wall. It's empty. There is no content. It's intentional. So there's nothing substantial or essential in consciousness. It's always empty. It's always consciousness of something, which means that it's always pure appearance. Whatever is appearing, whatever phenomenon is appearing at that moment in consciousness, that's what consciousness is. Which means that its appearance and its existence are identical. Its appearance, the way it appears, and what it really is, its being, its existence, are the same. And that makes it, Sartre says, the absolute. A term usually reserved for God, meaning something like the most real being, or being itself. And that's what we don't have to go to God. That's what consciousness is, because its appearance is identical to its existence, to its being. And that's section 3 probably the most difficult section we'll go through today. Okay, so section 4, the being of the percipi, which is again Latin for to be perceived, the thing perceived. So if we're still talking about perception, we've got the perceiver and the thing perceived. We've just dealt with the perceiver, the transphenomenal being of which was consciousness. So now we're going to look at this perceived, the percipi. Because Sartre recognizes that consciousness can't be our ontological bedrock. It can't be transphenomenal being in full. There must be something else, and that's the percipi. The being of the percipi cannot lie in consciousness either. Sartre points that out early on. However, he does say the percipi is relative and it's passive. So it's relative to consciousness. That much is clear. But Sartre's point is that the being of the percipi is not relative to consciousness. It stands alone on its own. And it's passive. We know that the percipi, as in something, just an object, is passive. It doesn't have any will or desire. It can't do anything on its own. It's just acted on by forces outside of which it's not the source, and so it's passive in that sense. But the point Sartre makes here is that yes, it's passive, but that passivity is still supported by the being of that phenomenon. So there's still, even though it's both, the percipi is both passive and relative, its being is still something independent that supports that existent on its own. And he also talks a little bit about creation here, and his main goal is to answer the confusion that could arise in talking about things, because they may have been created by God, and so their being, their existence, is in some way dependent on a creator God. So Sartre disagrees with that, and he says that even created being must tear itself away from its creator. And we see that the phenomena do this in the way that they reveal themselves through an infinite number of abschatung. So in this revelation, this style of revelation is the way that phenomena tear themselves away from any would-be creator. So even if there is a creator, their being, their existence is still centered in themselves. And so the conclusion of all of this is that we have this other fork of ontological bedrock. We've got consciousness now we've also got the transphenomenal being of the phenomenon. The next section 5, is an ontological proof. So ontological proofs are usually given in defense of the existence of God. The name being ontological, meaning that there's some tie-in with existence or being. So I won't investigate ontological proofs for the existence of God here. Sartre is going to use his ontological proof to prove the existence of this transphenomenal being of the phenomenon. And it's quite easy, actually. Basically all he says is that consciousness is intentional. We start with that. We've seen that. Consciousness is this hole in the wall. It's nothing in itself. It's directed at something else. And that means that there must be something else, something for it to be consciousness of. And that thing is this transphenomenal being of the phenomenon that we've discovered. And that's his ontological proof. And the last section, section 6, is about this transphenomenal being of the phenomenon, and it's called being in itself, and that's the term that Sartre will use. Saves us from saying transphenomenal being of the phenomenon all the time. So being in itself. The problem with this, and he opens with a problem, is that it's never fully revealed to consciousness. The being in itself, this ontological bedrock, doesn't appear, doesn't disclose itself to consciousness because it can never separate itself from the existent. It's always locked in, it's always tied in with the existent. We never catch it on its own. And there's no way to do that. But luckily, Sartre says that we can pass beyond the being, we can pass beyond the existent, or the phenomenon, through to what he says is the meaning of the being. So we can get to the meaning of the being, and we get to the meaning of the being by investigating those different adumbrations, by looking at how the existent reveals itself to us or discloses itself to us. The problem with that is that this meaning that we capture is still, it manifests as a phenomenon for us, like everything does. Everything manifests as a phenomenon. That's that old problem, the phenomenon of being and the being of the phenomenon. We can never get to that ontological bedrock through a phenomenon. It always obscures being. And we're back at that problem. We've kind of come full circle, and we can't escape that here. However, Sartre says that even though this meaning of the being, which we're angling past the phenomenon itself towards an ontological level, we're not going to get all the way, but we're angling there, we're getting there. It still appears, this meaning of the being still appears as a phenomenon, so it's not being itself, but it indicates being, and it, more importantly, it requires being. So that gives us some kind of insight into the existence of, into being in itself, which we can use to learn something about it. The word he uses here is a Heideggerian term, pre-ontological comprehension. This the fact that the meaning of this being that appears as a phenomenon to us indicates and requires being, lets us have a pre-ontological comprehension of it, gets us close so we can figure something out. That's kind of the gist of it, I think. So there are three things that Sartre says about being in itself to wrap up this section. The first is that being in itself is in itself. And what that means essentially is that it's completely independent. It's not related to or tied in with anything else. It's standalone. He also says being in itself is what it is. And that means that it does not refer to itself like consciousness does. We saw consciousness as that consciousness of consciousness. Consciousness can posit objects for itself. Being in itself doesn't do that. Being in itself just is what it is. It can't think about itself. And being in itself is. That's the third aspect here. And what that means is being in itself isn't possible. Possible and impossible are terms that relate to consciousness. And it's not necessary. It's not necessary either. Things around us, phenomena, existence, don't have to exist. Even though they do exist, they didn't have to. They're not necessary, which means that being in itself is contingent. So it didn't have to be here. Or these individual phenomena didn't have to be here, but they are, even though that they are. It's the way it is, but it didn't have to be that way. I've said that about 1,000 times, right? So Sartre also calls this being superfluous. And the word is de trop. Probably pronouncing that wrong, de trop, but it means superfluous or without reason, without connection to any other being. It kind of encapsulates quite nicely what Sartre thinks about being in itself. It's just there, no reason, no, it didn't have to be. It's by itself, just locked there. Being is in itself just is, and that is where we're going to finish this video. Next video we'll look at will be part 1, the problem of nothingness. Like all of these videos, if you have any thoughts and you're reading through, you've got any questions or thoughts or comments, anything I've said you disagree with or agree with, throw it down in the comments section. Check out absurdbeing.com if you have the time. Otherwise, I'll catch you for the second installment.